Hello and welcome to Give and Toke, presented by Plant Ed, the show that elevates the conversation about cannabis to a higher level. I'm your host Paul, and today we welcome Dr. Riley Kirk, who is an assistant adjunct professor at the University of Rhode Island, a renowned cannabis research scientist with a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences, and is the host of the Bioactive Podcast. With research interests broadly focused on the use of medicinal plants in combating antibiotic resistance and alternative pain treatments to opiates, she has studied the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants. She is passionate about providing free and accessible cannabis education to all users, primarily through social media channels. Dr. Riley sees education as an integral part of harm reduction and is currently researching the smoking process and how we can better predict what pharmacological effects this leads to. If you like what you hear on today's show, please make sure you like, follow, subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. If you want to get in touch, please contact us at giveandtoke@gmail.com or visit giveandtoke.com.au. But for now, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Riley Kirk. Welcome to the show, Dr. Riley Kirk.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's so nice to have you, and you are constantly breaking down barriers, one of which is that stoners usually get the reputation for not being on time. You are precisely on time, like probably 95% of my guests, so we get a bad rap in that way.
Yeah, I do have some friends that are chronically late and chronically high too. So, we're different people, but stoners and non-stoners are late all the time.
So growing up in Australia, all I know about New Hampshire is that it often indicates the outcome of presidential elections. What else is there to know about your beautiful part of the world?
Yeah, so I live in the USA. I live in the state of New Hampshire, which is right next to Maine, Massachusetts, and Vermont, which makes up New England. Kind of what we're known for is just having really beautiful mountains and beautiful seasons and a lot of amazing wildlife. My husband is a wildlife biologist, so he's really involved in, the biology up here, and I've learned a lot through him. We are known for kind of predicting the political outcome of elections, and we have quite the election coming up this year, so that'll be very interesting. But we're very not known for cannabis here. This state is not very cannabis friendly. I am involved in the advisory board, the Cannabis Advisory Board here in New Hampshire, trying to change that. But it is definitely an uphill battle that we are still doing every single day.
It is really interesting to live somewhere that is still kind of trying to figure cannabis out. I think anywhere where it's actually going well is still on the journey. So when we're further back and we're not in, super cannabis friendly states, or where we've got a pretty good medicinal system here in Australia, but we're still a long way away from that kind of home grow conversation, that adult use conversation. So it's important to be doing this work in these places, but I've had the pleasure of traveling through the New England area on an Amtrak before. It's a beautiful part of the world. Yeah, it's really, really lovely.
Yeah, it is. There's just like beautiful landscapes, and we have all four seasons, so we have that beautiful fall foliage and the hot summer right now. In the winter, everything freezes up and we just have this beautiful winter landscape, and spring, everything comes alive. So I really love living here. I just wish the weed situation was a little more chill.
I'm glad you mentioned your husband, Jake. This was kind of a bonus question I was going to save for later, but it does seem, in what I've listened to your work on your podcast where he's mentioned, he's an important part of your journey with the work he does. But something I'm fascinated about you guys is that you grow and eat most of your own food. Is that right?
Yeah, so we aim for 60%, and that is essentially through hunting, trapping, gardening, foraging, fishing. We're outside all of the time. We have a very intimate relationship with the outdoors, and we really enjoy the process of, getting our own food and being part of that system. And he's taught me a lot about specifically like hunting and trapping, and I've taught him a lot about gardening and foraging. So we kind of have this really traditional like hunter-gatherer relationship, which is pretty cool. But it's the same thing with weed. If you grow your own weed and you harvest it and you smoke it, it's such a different experience than if you were to just, go to a dispensary and buy it. And of course, as you're saying, like, obviously, all of us want to do that. We're just not there yet across the world or even the United States. So it's something that I think is a fundamental right to be able to grow your own medicine and your own food. And I think it's absolutely egregious that we're not quote, allowed to cultivate this medicinal plant that's never killed anyone. But then you look at my other medicinal plant garden and I'm growing, the plant produces ricin and datura that, has killed many people. It's just, there's such a double standard, and it really isn't backed in science. It's backed in control and propaganda. And we don't need to go down that road too long, but that is something we're passionate about.
Yeah, anyone that knows anything about cannabis is, these rules and regulations are heavily rooted in prohibitionist thinking. That's what we're dealing with here in Australia as well.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but we're making change. Every year we're making change, forward progress. It's all that matters, but it is definitely an uphill battle.
I like that you mentioned kind of that intentionality that comes from producing and growing your own things. When I have had the opportunity in Vancouver to grow my own cannabis, it lasts a lot longer than what I buy because I'm a lot more thoughtful. My wife and I just got a couple of chickens in our backyard, which, are free roaming, and it's kind of bringing me so much joy and so much happiness. And one of the unintended benefits of growing things is the mental health boost. So while we kind of speak about having cannabis to help mental health, I know that having this lifestyle helps my mental health, growing things, tending to them, watching them, become a real thing.
Slowing down, understanding energy systems. Like, I struggled with an eating disorder for many years when I was growing up, through high school, college. I didn't have a good relationship with food. I didn't understand what went into food and how much, work went into cultivating either that, meat or that crop. And it really was until I started like growing my own stuff and being part of that process that I realized that the mental health aspect, like that literally is what cured me, is being part of that system and understanding like everything that I touch, like the energy I'm putting into it comes back to my body, and like I can nourish myself in that way. And, obviously that wasn't an overnight thing, but as I continue to cultivate more things, and we have quail too, like being able to eat the eggs from the birds that you're feeding every day. Like, it's a really beautiful thing. And being able to slow down too, and, touch some dirt and like look at your plants every day. I think anybody can grow plants. It just takes like attention, water, and sunlight, and some soil, right? But like attention's the big one. You don't just plant your plants and forget about them. You have to continue to love for them and care for them and make sure they have what they need. And then, it helps you too, because it gets you outside every day. It gets you touching soil and dirt and in the sunlight. And it really is this like beautiful way to get more involved in your food.
I've said this to many guests, but I do sometimes wish this was a video podcast so people could see the vibrancy that comes as you start speaking about that, the big smile on your face. So yeah, intentionality, getting in touch with the earth, these things are really important. I think sometimes with cannabis, they're seen as kind of hippie things, but I think they're actually just really central to the experience.
Yeah, and like the hippies were onto something too. Like the hippies were really happy. And, it's not something to discount. Like, we do have an epidemic of sadness, of people not being mentally okay right now. And, I attribute a lot of that is the further we get away from nature, the sadder people get. And I feel like we really need to intentionally put ourselves back into these systems and like take the time to notice things. So many people are getting up, really early, going to work, coming home in the dark, and they never have that experience with their surroundings. And, you don't need to live in the mountains. You can live in the city and have a community garden. You can have a window box. You can have a tomato plant in your living room. Like, you don't need acres and acres to grow. Just like watching something grow and produce something that you can consume. It's absolutely beautiful.
It is. It is. Well, Riley, today you are an assistant adjunct professor at the University of Rhode Island, a renowned cannabis research scientist with a huge following on social media, and the host of the Bioactive Podcast. Let's kind of go back to how this all started. What came first, a love for cannabis or a love for science?
Cannabis for sure. Yeah, like it's so funny. I meet so many people and they're like, I knew I wanted to be a scientist since I was 4 years old. I'm like, really? I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. But I started using cannabis at 14 years old, which, everyone's like, oh, that's so young. And it's like, kind of, but it's also about the average age that people do start experimenting with things like cannabis and alcohol and other substances. And from the second I tried cannabis, I just knew that it meshed well with my brain. But at this point, I didn't understand anything about the plant, right? I was just like, whoa, that feels like really, really, really good. And, at this point in my life, looking back, I realized a lot of that was likely, I have a very hyperactive brain. I've had seizures. I have like a ADHD kind of personality where I like have to be doing 8 things at once or I can't think. And cannabis just like perfectly meshes with my brain and makes me like slow down and think normal. And, now that I understand the ECS and I understand cannabis more, I get why my body reacts so positive to it. But from that time I first consumed, I essentially never stopped since. I've taken a couple breaks, but it's been pretty consistent ever since. And it wasn't like when I even graduated from college, I was like, I still don't know what I want to do. And I ended up getting a job in a different type of laboratory that studies the immune system. And I was like, oh my gosh, I hate this. Like, I don't want to be doing this for the rest of my life. So then I was like really trying to think internally and be like, what do I like doing? Like, what's something I could make for my whole life, a career out of it? And it actually wasn't cannabis that I was like, oh, that's the thing. It was natural products. It was nature. It was understanding all these different medicinal plants and how they work. I've always been someone to like extract different plants and make topicals and make fun things out of it. But I never understood the research on it. I couldn't read it. I was like, what language is this in? It's not English. Like I cannot understand this. So I just started this deep dive and I found this program. It's called Pharmacognosy, and it's a branch of pharmaceutical sciences that focuses on studying nature as a source of new drugs. So I literally applied to a one graduate program. I got in. I had the best like PI boss in the world. Like we're still boys, we're friends. And I had a really positive like experience in graduate school. But mind you, I was a stoner through all of this. Like I'm an open cannabis consumer. I talk like one, I walk like one, I am one, right? So like when the University of Rhode Island started releasing a cannabis studies program, like as a graduate program, they needed a teaching assistant for it. And everyone's like, oh, well, Riley, like she loves weed. So I was kind of just like put into this position just because I've done so much research on my own time and like I love this plant. So I was chosen for that position. And while I was TAing for that, I was helping them make educational videos and make, additional content and just like ways to help teach these students. And I kind of had this epiphany because this was right when like COVID was starting. And I was like, why are people paying $7,000 for this? It should be just like free education. Like we're all consuming cannabis and this is literally harm reduction. We're teaching people how to use the plant based on the pharmacology of how it reacts in your body. So when the pandemic hit, I'm a scientist. I was at home for the first time in a very long time, just like chilling. And I was like, what's TikTok? This looks fun. So I hit the button and I was like, I'm going to record myself talking about, cannabis science. And literally the first video I posted like blew up and it got so many views, so many follows. So I just kept creating content from there. And I actually got my first job in the cannabis industry from my TikTok videos because they needed someone who was an educator and a communicator. So after that job, I worked in the industry for a few years and now I've started my own research and education nonprofit with the other co-founder, Dr. Miyabi Shields. And we're doing some really cool research and we're collaborating with some just absolutely amazing companies in the space and kind of trying to represent, you were talking about, the stoner in a much more positive light. It's, we've never seen research look at the cannabis community in a positive way or even a neutral way. It's always like this really like, look at this group of drug addicts. But we are very healthy, like mentally and physically, typically. We're very happy. We avoid a lot of medications. We see reductions in alcohol. We see reductions in opiates. So why aren't we ever framing research in a positive light? And that's really like our core competency, like what we're focusing on through this nonprofit is like giving a voice to the cannabis community and showing research in a positive light because it's never in a positive light. And we think like it's about time to shift the tide and like show some of this, not just positives, but also like practical applications of cannabis. A lot of times you'll see a study released on like this terpene it kills Staphylococcus bacteria. And you're like, okay, like what happens if I smoke it though? Like it doesn't really correlate to my experience, So we're trying to like gather community data and pair that with biochemical data to get a better idea of cannabis medicine and how it benefits us and the community in different ways.
Yeah, you're doing really important work because it's moving on from the guy on the couch being like, yeah, just trust me, bro. Like I know the science to actually trying to figure it out. So, where I'm from, it's often used as an excuse to kind of justify delaying not having legalization yet. And that's, we still have all this research to be done. We still don't know so much about cannabis. Let's talk about what we do know though. What is the science telling us about cannabis? What are some of the positives? I mean, even what are some of the neutral things we've discovered about cannabis that we can kind of lean on scientifically?
Okay,
it's very broad, I know.
It is broad. It is broad. I was like, okay. Yeah. So first of all, like when people say we don't have enough science, I'm always like, oh, where do you want to see more science? Because I know they've never looked into it. They just say like, we don't have enough science, just blanket statement. We have over 30,000 published papers on cannabis and the endocannabinoid system and understanding these dynamics. We have a lot of information out there. Of course, with literally anything, we can always use more research. But I think when we're talking about cannabis, it's really important to like frame the conversation that like weed is not weed is not weed. It's not just weed, right? We have so many different cultivars that have so many different molecules present, different ratios present. They're dried and cured in different ways. There's so many differences. There's, concentrates that people are dabbing, and then there's flour, and then, there's suppositories and edibles, and they're all going to act a little bit differently in our body. So where I think we need a little more data is understanding the different cohorts of people and how they react positively, negatively, differently of these different products and these different doses. Because, a lot of what we're missing is practical information. And, I mentioned harm reduction before, but if we just had more education and information on general dosing of the major cannabinoids and terpenes, I think that would be the most like valuable thing that we could have. So people could actually have a guide and say, okay, like if I don't want to feel high, but I have chronic pain, I should take this dose of CBG with CBD. Really understanding how to use this medicine as a tool and how consumers can like control their dose and their medicine in different ways. Because cannabis is extremely, extremely, extremely safe compared to almost any other drug that we use either recreationally or pharmaceutically, right? It has never killed someone on its own, which is so different than all of these other drugs that we're talking about. So we know it's safe. We know it's very efficacious for so many different things. I think even as a preventative medicine, it is a huge benefit. Think of like every disease is essentially caused by inflammation at some point. Usually in the start of it, starts with chronic inflammation, leads to some sort of disarray in the body, which leads to some condition coming up. Cannabis is a great anti-inflammatory medicinal plant. It can reduce inflammation in your body, and that can prevent so many different conditions from arising in the first place because you're just suppressing that chronic inflammation that we're exposed to all the time. I think really where we run into issues is when we think about cannabis as just THC, which happens all the time, right? When we think about like, oh, you smoked cannabis. Does that mean that you smoked THC dominant cannabis? Not necessarily, but that's what we think about. And I think if we can frame the conversation more of thinking of it as like tools, you have these different tools, these types of cannabis tools. I think that would change the conversation a little more, and especially like in the political realm, right? If we can talk about it as the consumer being able to control their dose and the level of high that they get and being able to curate their own medicine, I think that's something that a lot of people really don't understand. I think specifically like older populations of people, politicians, your, 70-year-old people, they're thinking like, weed is weed is weed. We're all going to react the same. We're all going to get absolutely blasted. I was just talking to my mom this past weekend. I smoke a full joint all the time. Like that's my serving size. I smoke a joint. And, she was like, oh my God, can you smoke a full joint? And I'm like, yeah, like all the time, but if I were to like smoke a cigarette, I would be absolutely on my ass because I don't use nicotine and it reacts really, really strongly with me. I'm not going to tell the whole world to stop selling nicotine and stop using nicotine. I just understand that my body and my tolerance and like the way my brain reacts to things doesn't love nicotine. And I should have the freedom to, make that decision for my own body and my health and, not just have these blanket things made illegal or legal based on how a small population of people reacts to them.
I'll spend time with people who have had legitimately 15 or 16 beers and half a bottle of liquor. And they look at me on my third joint. They're like, whoa, man, I don't know how you can handle that stuff. And I'm like, I can't have more than 2 drinks. And, it is just about adults being able to choose the thing that works for them.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, okay, if the government was like actually trying to protect everyone, we wouldn't see alcohol, we wouldn't see nicotine, we wouldn't see a lot of these other pharmaceutical drugs. But that's not what it's about. Like, it's really not. And even so, like, cannabis is still substantially more healthy than all of these other substances. So, I think all of us are waiting for it to make sense. But I think using science as advocacy is really, really important. And that's something else that our nonprofit is trying to do, is essentially gather data so that consumers can use the data we put out to advocate for themselves, whether that's advocating in front of their parents, advocating in front of their healthcare providers, their doctors, advocating in front of politicians. Like, you want to see data, but like specifically with the daily consumer, quote, stoner community, we don't have data on us because we've never been researched. And we need that data to show that, we're really not harmful to society or ourselves. The biggest harm is this prohibition that we're currently in, because that's what gets us incarcerated and in trouble, not the actual substance,
You've mentioned politicians there a couple of times. I know that
Yeah.
you've, walked the steps of Capitol Hill, or whatever the building is called. Tell us about that experience and, kind of what you're going in aiming to do. And more importantly, what are the responses you're getting from the political class?
Yeah, so it's really, 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 really frustrating. I got to say that right off the rip. I mean, part of it is just like, I run 4 businesses. I'm a scientist. I'm also like, I'm doing a lot of things, and it's a lot of donated time. The second that you get into politics, it's a lot of donated time, which is why we see a lot of older people in politics, right? They might be retired. They have that flexibility, which is great. It's great that they're involved, but that's also the group of people that's been subjected to the most propaganda about this plant. So now you're dealing with these decision makers are these typically older people, and they're not necessarily up to date on the research or the community or even like what society's doing. So a lot of times when I go there, when I go to the state house, if there's like a bill proposed or something at the state house, I'll usually show up if it's a bad one specifically. I want to be there to talk about why we shouldn't pass it. And I try to use science as my like main thing. Like, I'm always citing papers, I'm always talking about things. And that is really well received by them, specifically like the older population of people. They don't even know some of this research exists. I remember we had a bill proposed that said that we could not have any outdoor or greenhouse cultivated cannabis. It all had to be indoor. And they were like, there's no rationale why we would need this. And I'm like, yeah, there is. I'm like, we actually have a study published that shows that there's unique molecules produced in outdoor cannabis compared to indoor cannabis. And that has increased therapeutic value to medical patients and to just recreational consumers as well. And they were just like, what? Can you send this to me? And I'm like, oh, absolutely. I sent it to them. I printed it out. And, after that, I had a few politicians come up to me after and be like, that was really amazing. Like, we want to hear more of this science-backed stuff so that we can make educated decisions too. But on their end, it's kind of hard because they don't always know who to trust either if people aren't backing what they're saying in science or anything that's kind of deeper rooted than just opinion. And of course, opinion is important and personal stories are really important. But when you get to like the legislative level, you really need to be prepared and backed in order to uphold your testimony. So overall, it's been accepted. And I just wish I had more time to be there all the time, because I know like when something's going on and I'm traveling, I'm at a conference, or I just can't be there, I feel really bad that I'm missing it and I can't be there to help support the community. And we actually just had a bill that didn't go through that would have actually given us an adult use market here, or recreational market. So it's pretty back and forth, but it is a lot of donated time. But I think in general, like, backing up what you're saying with any sort of data or any sort of like numbers that you can support it, even if they're numbers like within the industry, being like, oh, well, California did, $15 million in sales in last quarter. They'd be like, wow, really? It's like, yeah, this is why we need this industry, So I think overall, just being professional, definitely part of it. But I also go up there and I'm like, I am a daily cannabis consumer. And I've had politicians be like, what do you consume for? And then I'm like, I don't need to answer that. But like, I also just kind of like shifting their own opinions on what they think a stoner is, because like I wear a suit when I go up there. Like I'm very, very buttoned up and put together. And they're always like, really? And I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of us out there that are like, we have jobs, we are parts of society, and we can still medicate every day and be very functional members of society.
Someone like you is certainly a huge asset to this fight, getting up there with that doctor in front of your name, with that suit on, and saying, hey, there are other ideas to this other than just being a useless stoner. Because let's reclaim that word, to be honest.
I agree. I actually love the word stoner. I don't find it a negative at all. And I think you can use it as a huge, positive, especially if you continue the conversation around it, which I think for a little bit will be like, yeah, I'm a stoner. And then a couple sentences, after that. But I also think it's important, we talk about the safety of cannabis. We talk about stoners being really functional and like members of society. But like with any substance, there are ways to abuse it. Like there we can't ignore that some people do overdo it with cannabis, and that maybe they should take a break, and that they don't have a healthy balance between it, and that's fine. Like, so I think we need to, as a community, like acknowledge that there are some people that might need to reevaluate their relationship with it to have a healthy relationship, and that's where tolerance breaks can be really happy. And as a community, we need to kind of emphasize that healthy relationship and not just be like, unlimited amounts of cannabis are fine forever, because some people do have trouble with like regulating amount of anything they put in their body. If you have a very addictive personality, you might, hit THC a little too hard and not be able to work while you use cannabis. So understanding your own brain and understanding your own limits is really important too. Cannabis is safe. It's not safer than water though. There are limitations.
That's good. I think tolerance is a good segue, because I wanted to ask you, I noticed that you and I are kind of edible limit twinsies. 5 milligrams is good and 10 milligrams can be too much. With that being said, I have a huge tolerance for flower, and I assume, with you smoking full joints that you are similar. There's so many reasons, within our biochemistry why the tolerance might work like that. What's your take on that? Is edible tolerance something I've got to work my way through, or is that just something that's maybe not going to work for me?
No, I think you could work through it, but with edibles, there's really just there's way more levels of complexity. But when we think about why some people react positively, why some people react negatively to edibles, why some people can't feel edibles, why some people can only feel them after like 2 hours, right? Because when we talk about edibles versus smoking, when we're talking about edibles, we're now dealing with our liver processing that edible before it reaches our brain. So all of us have slightly different, levels of liver enzymes and efficiency of those enzymes. So some of us are going to process it really fast. Some people are going to process it really slow. Some people can't process them at all. So I think with like edible tolerance, it can hit people a little bit harder too, because, both of us, like 5 milligrams, great. Yeah. 10, not having a good time. So like with edible tolerance, because when our liver is processing THC, it's actually turning it into a different molecule called 11-hydroxy THC, which is a product of the metabolism in our liver. And that molecule hits a little bit different than regular delta 9 THC, as if we were smoking. And I think that's a lot of why we feel very different with edibles, and it often hits us harder. But you can still build a tolerance, and a lot of people do build a tolerance pretty quickly to edibles, that they notice, like maybe it takes them, that they're comfortable at 5 milligrams, but if you're consistently dosing, after 2 weeks, you might need 10. And then after another month, you might need 20 milligrams. You might need to keep raising it. And that's just anecdotal. I'm not like citing a study here, but I think you can get a tolerance from anything, but the way you consume, like, I think there are individual tolerances with your consumption method. Do you dry herb vape at all, or do you use concentrates at all?
I do use dry herb vaping. So in Australia, technically, the only way we're supposed to legally consume our medicinal cannabis is through dry herb vaporization. Obviously, our medical professionals understand that people are adults, are allowed to make their own decisions, but only the stores and Bic Almighty is like medically approved. Everyone gets cheaper vaporizers, obviously.
Yeah, it's
But yeah, we've got a
expensive.
very prescriptive system in that regard.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I love dry herb vaping. This is what I actually keep in my office. I know this isn't video, but this is a dry herb vape actually attached to a bong. Have you ever
Ah,
seen
very
these
cool.
before? These are
Yeah,
really
I have. So
cool.
it's kind of like the Dynavape type thing plugged into into a bong.
Yeah, so it's called a screwball vape, and essentially this like metal cylinder thing is the heating coil, and you put it over your kind of bong insert here, and then when you pull on the bong and you're pulling air through, it's pulling that hot air through, but you're not combusting. So I really enjoy dry herb vaping too, but you might even notice with dry herb vaping that it might hit you a little harder than smoking. Like I notice I get kind of zooted every time I dry herb vape, which doesn't necessarily happen with smoking. But if you really think of it from a chemistry perspective, if you are dry herb vaping, you are essentially creating a concentrate because you are only vaping the cannabinoids and terpenes, the active compounds, and you're leaving all the rest behind. Whereas if you're combusting, you're taking all of that in. So there's a lot more chemistry entering your body when you smoke, whereas you're vaping, you're taking in kind of similar amount of compounds, but they're going to be all focused in the ones that are bioactive, your cannabinoids and terpenes. So it hits you a lot harder, and there's a lot less degradation too. So just thinking about the different consumption methods and like what is the chemistry actually entering your body, that's going to really change the way you think about tolerance and consumption methods. And that's why I change up my consumption methods all the time. I have a bunch of dab tools behind me. I have my dryer vape here at home. Like I smoke a lot, but I always like to switch it up because I find they feel really, really different.
Again, I'm disappointed this is not a video podcast
I
because yeah,
know.
there's some great little show and tell going on there. But I do really appreciate you sharing kind of your personal regime. It is important to change things up, and it kind of explains why, even though I know that I'm going to get better effects out of like a bag from my volcano vaporizer than I
Yeah,
am a joint, I still love rolling up a joint and
I
sitting
do
back and
too.
enjoying that full thing.
There's just something so different about rolling up. I mean, obviously part of that is like the ritual and the intention, right? Of like, I love the act of rolling. I think it's really, really meditative in a way.
We'll be right back. Podcast listeners regularly ask me where they can go to learn more about medicinal cannabis, and today I've got the answer: Plant Ed. When you visit planteducation.net.au, you'll find an array of class-leading courses and modules covering topics like cannabis and depression, inflammation reduction, the endocannabinoid system, side effects of use, and more. Whether you're a healthcare professional or a patient, you work in the industry, or you're just feeding your curiosity, planteducation.net.au offers both free and paid courses from experts including Dr. Dustin Sulak, Dr. John Tay, and Dr. Orit Holtzman. With over 50 hours of free educational content, make planteducation.net.au your first stop for expanding your cannabis knowledge. And for a limited time, listeners of this podcast will receive 10% off any paid courses by using the code GIVETOKE10 at checkout. And that's GIVETOKE10 at checkout. So visit planteducation.net.au to see their range of courses designed to nurture your knowledge and understanding of the power of medicinal cannabis.
And also, like, I really love to walk outside when I smoke joints. So now you have this kind of environmental change. You have the fresh air. And then also, I was talking to someone who's a hippie like myself, and we were talking about smoking, and she was really focusing on the breath work of smoking compared to other consumption methods. How you take these really like intentional deep breaths that are spaced apart. And she's like, it's just like meditating, but you're smoking a joint, So you have like kind of a duality of the spiritual aspects of it. And I think being able to listen to your body, and if you can afford it, like having different consumption methods, I think it's great to have different tools, having different types of flower, CBD dominant flower, CBG dominant flower, THC dominant flower. You learn to mix them together for whatever you're feeling, whatever your needs are that day. Again, really looking at cannabis as a tool and all these other consumption methods as tools as well, instead of just like, I smoke to get high.
I think that's a nice segue into the science of smokability. Given that we're mentioning these consumption methods, this is a really fascinating project, on its own, but I think also as Australians, where we're kind of being told, do not smoke, only vaporize. I think it's really important, particularly when, in the States there are a lot of adult use markets. I lived in Canada where there's a federal adult use market, and the smokability of something really matters to consumers. It really matters to companies. It matters on a scientific level, so we know what's going into our body. So now there's obviously a great half an hour podcast where you get the whole team together on Bioactive. That's a really great listen, but I'm hoping you can maybe break it down, in a nutshell.
Sure, absolutely. So the project, Science of Smokability, I actually want to start by saying it's funny that you talk about like Australia not allowing smokable products, because when we were first introducing the Science of Smokability and we were talking about how we were going to study the science of smoking, immediately another scientist was like, well, why on earth would you study that? Like, you should only study dry herb vaping. It is the only healthy way to consume. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like, but that's not what people do.
No.
We're here to represent the people and like the practical science. And most consumers still prefer smoking as their consumption method. So instead of just deleting that fact, let's study it a little more. Like, there's something behind that, clearly. And we also believe, that people who do prefer smoking, especially medical patients, deserve to have quality cannabis. And we don't really have a way to quantify quality cannabis from a smoking perspective at all. Like, we've never had any metrics to study this. So really where this all came from is we read into literature from the tobacco industry a lot. Like, that's where it helps us guide a lot of our science in the cannabis industry. And we really realized that the tobacco industry has done a ton of research on the smokability of tobacco, but nobody's ever published on the smokability of cannabis, right? So we're like, we want to be the ones to do this. And essentially, it's our nonprofit teaming up with the Cannabis Research Coalition, who cultivates cannabis. So they're growing the weed. And then we're doing the, chemistry and also the community aspect. And we wanted to grow cannabis in different soil types, different nutrient loads, different environments, different inputs, and then give some out to consumers and also study the chemistry and say, what are consumers really gravitating towards? What are they calling quality cannabis? And how can we quantify that and really understand how to make that reproducible from a cultivation aspect, but also post-harvest, the dry and cure. That might be the most important part for a quality cannabis product, making sure that you can still roll it, the rollability, as I call it. Like, if you've ever tried to roll some dispensary weed that just disintegrates when you like touch it, it's really,
Yeah.
really hard to roll, and it doesn't smoke well at all. There's not enough moisture in there, right? And it wasn't dried and cured properly. So we're in we just finished we're still in phase 1 of Science of Smokability, where we're looking at different moisture content of different flowers. So we looked at 0.45, 0.65, and 0.85. And then we actually didn't send out the 0.85 to consumers because we thought it might grow mold. So we didn't send that one out, but we did send the other ones out. And then we also smoked these pre-rolls in a smoking machine, which is so cool. It's literally a little machine with a port that you put a pre-roll in, and then it like puffs every X amount of seconds. And then we collect the smoke extract from that and we analyze it in the laboratory. So we don't have the data back yet. We're still analyzing it. But essentially what we're looking for is saying, if people are smoking anyway, is there a healthier way to cultivate the plant to make sure that less toxicants are getting to the consumer and that it's a higher quality product so that they're having a better experience and it's reducing the amount of potential harmful things that are reaching them? I can't believe nobody's ever done this before. It's like, the absolutely most fundamental studies that we need in this industry. And so phase 1's moisture activity, water activity. Phase 2 is going to be nutrient loads. So understanding if we put a lot of nitrogen into a plant, what happens to the smoke profile when we smoke that plant, versus something like, magnesium or something, just, a different compound. But we have a lot of evidence, like if we do put excessive nutrients into a plant, or if we don't flush the plants of nutrients, that it could produce pretty harmful compounds when we're inhaling it, but we don't know that yet. So, just producing this fundamental knowledge that we're publicly sharing, that any cultivator can use this information, anybody who's a medical patient can look it up. And hopefully this is going to result in some sort of like metric that we can rate flower based on its smokability and the way it's cultivated and, post-harvest, that we can rate quality by just looking at the way it's been, produced. So that's kind of our goals of it. And we're we're really bringing along the community for the whole thing, because we really don't believe the voices of the community have been appreciated like at all in science. And we do believe like the community are the experts in this medicine. It's not the random people studying it in these universities. It's the community, the people who've been consuming it for 30 years. Like, we know a lot, but we've never had a way to leverage that information and actually study it.
Flushing is one of those science bro things I've heard both sides of the spectrum. Like, you got to do it, man. 2 weeks, you got to flush it. Then others who tell me, nah, there's no science to it. Are we past the anecdotal stage on flushing yet? Do we have an answer or close to?
Yeah, I think it definitely matters. I think, I don't know if like the data's been there yet, but I know from probably every cultivator that I know, like professional in the industry, that it definitely matters for the quality of that final product. And if you probably would know if you've smoked cannabis that has not been properly flushed at all, because it's almost like crystalline. Like, it's like, it looks weird, it feels weird, it smokes weird. It's just like, it's not the same level of quality. But I think part of that issue too is the cannabis plant is very resilient to really high levels of nutrients, really high levels. And I think oftentimes in the industry, we might push that a little too far. Like, maybe we don't need to be putting that much nitrogen into the plant. So I think that's going to be also like a delicate balance to find, is like, do we even need to be putting this much in the first place? Because then when we flush it, like, are we actually flushing it all out? And would we be in a better place if we just put less in to begin with and probably got pretty similar yields and had a better final product? I think we need kind of that more practical nuance in the conversation.
Another science bro thing is, the color of ash. I would say personally, I've had great cannabis that doesn't have white ash, but anything I've ever had with white ash has always been great. So it doesn't need to have white, but if it is white, it's usually really good. What are the scientific thoughts on ash?
Yeah, that's actually a huge part of Science of Smokability, and that's what a lot of people care about. They're like, okay, tell me about ash color. And actually, what we send out with Science of Smokability is an ash color guide, and it's part of the survey that we actually take with the consumers so that they can rate their ash color. What we know is not a lot other than bro science, because I'm in the same position. Almost all cannabis that I've smoked with white ash has been fire. And I've had a couple with the darker ash. That's okay. But what we found from phase 1, though, is higher water activity does correlate with lighter ash. So that could be part of the story as well. And essentially, every phase of this, we're going to be evaluating ash color. And I think by the end, we should have a pretty good idea of what goes into that and what really constitutes like a lighter ash versus a darker ash. And if people can control that, because again, that's been studied in the tobacco industry a lot. And they found that, if you smoke it a lot hotter, it is going to produce lighter ash. So, that likely is part of it too.
This is a really exciting project because there's clearly huge implications for the industry. Companies might be able to say that, they've mastered the science of smokability by doing, X and O at, like you said, the curing stage or whatever it might be. Consumers are going to be more informed and therefore be able to make better choices about the cannabis that they consume. So particularly coming from Australia, where we aren't, we've got our head in the sands about smoking. I'm really excited to see what comes from this. I know you guys have dived into this without a lot of external funding and without investments. As you've now started the project, and it's a couple of months on since I've listened to that first podcast, are you starting to see a lot more interest and potential investment coming along?
Oh, yeah. We have quite a few sponsors now. Actually, it's pretty much all from the cannabis industry, which is really cool. A lot of big players in the cannabis industry want to support this. And, we've got a lot of positive PR from it. We were in Forbes, we were in High Times. People are interested in this project, and especially like the community aspect of it, because that's what people are sharing on social media too. And companies want to be part of that. So even like these large MSOs, these multi-state operators, they kind of have kind of a bad rep in the cannabis industry. Kind of people are like, ew, giant MSOs. But we have some sponsorship from these MSOs. And I think that actually means a lot on their side, that they want to invest in this essentially journey to quality cannabis, because people think that they don't produce quality cannabis. And they're like, okay, well, let's learn how to do it. And, a lot of people would give a shit for taking that money, that sponsorship money from those MSOs. And we're like, no, we think that's a huge positive for our industry if these massive companies, really want to follow the science. I think we should be encouraging that, not just like, telling everyone to F off that we don't, believe in every part of their ethics. Like, I think it's great that they're showing interest.
I want to take a little break from our cannabis conversation and play a quick little game with you called Hotbox, where it's would you rather type questions, mostly related to cannabis. How does that sound?
It sounds great. I can't wait.
Best thing about working in cannabis?
Free weed and swag all the time.
Worst thing about working in cannabis?
Oh, the LinkedIn bros. I think that's probably, that's tough for me.
Indica, sativa, or hybrid?
I'm a sativa girl. I'm like, even like right before bed, I can smoke your biggest upper strain and I'll be absolutely fine. But I think that's also part of like the ADHD brain kind of a thing. Like it doesn't make me feel the way it makes other people feel. It makes me just feel like silent in my brain. So a sativa to me is not a sativa to a listener listening to the podcast.
Flower or edibles?
Flower.
Joints or blunts?
Joints, but blunts on special occasions with the girls.
Would you rather be able to fly like a butterfly or jump like a cricket?
Fly, definitely fly.
Clam chowder or lobster rolls?
Lobster rolls. I love lobster. I just had some over 4th of July weekend.
Favorite place to consume cannabis?
In my backyard with my dog.
Favorite cannabis product on the market right now?
This grinder from Flower Mill, I don't know if you use this or if any of the listeners use the Flower Mill. It's actually not a grinder, it's a mill. I know it's not a video, but I'm gonna show you.
Oh, looks pretty.
So the top is not like a toothed grinder, and it really maintains the integrity of your cannabis. This changed my life, and the reason I got this grinder is I met the owner of this company on accident in New York City. So I had like a $12 grinder from Amazon, and I met this guy who like owned this really fancy grinder company. And he's like, I know who you are and what you do. That is so embarrassing that you have that grinder. he's like, if you throw that away right now, I will give you one of my grinders. And I'm like, okay. Yeah. And I just yeeted it. And I'm like, yay. And I've had this ever since. And they are expensive, but they're really, really heavy. And like the weight helps you like really mill it a lot easier. It will change your life if you get a flower mill.
Best munchie snack?
Mango or watermelon. I love fruit because it's like a snack and a drink. It's awesome.
That is the most stoner thing anyone's ever said in this game. Finally, describe your perfect 420.
Oh, my perfect 420. Okay, I would definitely with my girls from college. Like I'm still best friends with them. Definitely with all of them. Maybe like at a beach with unlimited weed and a bunch of dab tools, and then we could go swimming in between and just hang out all day, and then somebody to drive us home so we can get absolutely zooted.
Sounds absolutely delightful and responsible too. Well done, Riley.
I had to put that in there,
That's fantastic. Well, returning back to our conversation, I'm fascinated to know, one of your big passions is the medicinal value of plants as a whole. You mentioned obviously earlier in the show that that's a passion of yours and an interest. How did that come to be? And, what have you learned and how is that still a part of your life?
Yeah, it came to be. I grew up in Maine, and like I spent a lot of time in the woods just foraging, finding interesting things. I had like a Peterson field guide to wild plants, and I would just go out there and try to find as many as I can and read about them. And in graduate school, I studied dozens, if not hundreds of medicinal plants. And really, I made an extract library and I was screening them against all of these different pathogens and these crazy things. And really where that comes into play today is I have the ability to really compare and contrast cannabis with these other traditionally used medicinal plants. And they all have value, right? Like they have amazing value, both historically and contemporarily. But I think really understanding how unique cannabis is because of the way it interacts with our endocannabinoid system in our body, no other plant does what cannabis does. It is incredibly unique. It is incredibly special. And it really does have way more medicinal value than probably any other plant on the planet because it interacts with our body in such a unique way. I mean, your endocannabinoid system controls everything in your body. And the fact that cannabis can interact with this system, that's why cannabis is good for appetite and inflammation and mood and pain and, absolutely everything, because it interacts with the system that controls everything in our body, which is just incredibly, incredibly special. And I think I really got that unique perspective change from studying these other plants and then studying cannabis and being like, wow, this is like pretty incredible.
I know I'm sometimes guilty of being like, plant medicine's amazing, but I only know about cannabis, you know? So I think a lot of us are guilty like that, being like, yeah, no, the power of plants, man. But then I can't tell you about the power of any other plant. So I'm glad that you have the passion and you're doing the work, because that information needs to be out there. There's more to plant medicine than just cannabis.
Yeah, and I'm sure you heard about them, but like what we call here like girl blunts, which is when you take, cannabis and you might mix it with lavender or sage, something else. And I think it's really funny that we're always like, we need more research on cannabis, but then we'll like smoke anything and we don't know what happens. We don't know what happens when we smoke lavender, like at all. Like it could transform into things that could be harmful to us. So I actually think that's where we need a little more research, is really understanding when we mix other herbs with cannabis, like, is it creating a synergistic effect, or could it potentially be producing things that maybe aren't that good for us? It could be either. I don't really know. It could also just be situational. And if you do use a dry herb vape, actually, I have a volcano as well. And if you remember when you opened your volcano, it came with a little packet, or at least mine did, where it talked about the vaporization temperature of other herbs. And I've actually used that quite a bit, and it's actually pretty nice. Like I grow a lot of chamomile, and chamomile is one of the nicest herbs to vaporize with cannabis. It creates this like really, really sweet taste in your mouth. And it doesn't irritate your throat at all, but it really adds to like the overall effect in a unique way. So I don't know if every herb is safe to vaporize, but a few of the ones I've tried have been pretty cool.
It reminds me a little bit too much of my university years, where I was trying to like save on cannabis expenditure. So I'd be mixing it with like the worst Earl Grey tea leaves and things like that. So I haven't quite stepped back or been game enough to step back into the mixing with other herbs world, because there's a bit too much PTSD from being, a cheap university student there.
That's totally fair. And like another thing I don't think people think about with vaping or smoking other herbs is like, you don't just buy them on Amazon and then smoke them. Like, we're always so worried about the pesticides and heavy metals in cannabis. Like, bro, look into your other stuff too. Look into the other stuff you're smoking. Look into your food. Like, your food's less regulated than the cannabis you're consuming. So like, all of these concerns we have with cannabis safety, like, look a little broader too. You might have more questions.
All right. I want to talk a little bit about the Bioactive Podcast just as we head towards the tail end of the show. Again, thank you so much for your time. I could talk to you for hours, but also whilst being mindful of that donated time you're constantly giving people. So thank you again for being here.
I don't mind it in this case. It's just politicians I have problems with.
I also knew you wouldn't have said it if you thought it about me, so I appreciate that. So look, I mean, social media in general is, a huge platform for you. You have hundreds of thousands of followers on TikTok, millions of likes across multiple platforms. How is it operating in this space? I'd love to know, kind of from a community perspective, what it's like to deal with people and their passions for cannabis, but then also the level of dealing with the censorship that's existing on a lot of these platforms. So it's kind of a two-pronged question there.
Yeah, I think the people aspect is both a pro and a con, but I really enjoy it for the most part because we've been so limited on this, like the practical studies that we can do with cannabis. Listening to community stories and listening to different perspectives is so important. And especially like with my platforms, I really love to encourage that in the comment section. So I've learned an insane amount from this community. I'm incredibly thankful for that. At the same time, people are quite passionate about this plant, which I totally understand. And because of that, like almost anything you say, either pro or con about cannabis, you're going to get inundated with people that feel very passionately the other way. And, on social media, you really can't take the time to like sit down and educate every single person. So for me, like I try to be really respectful, but if people aren't being respectful to me, I slam that block button. Like, you don't deserve to be on my channel with this free education if you're going to treat me like that, like ever. Like, I do not put up with that. So that's the way I protect my mental health on the internet, because it is a pretty rambunctious space sometimes. Then there's the censorship, which is like this whole nother beast, right? You can't say the words THC, CBD, hemp, smoke, all of these words are highly censored on the internet, which really does limit the quality of the education that we're getting out there. We've seen new creators using the word gardening for using, cannabis. And I think that's great. But at the same time, like, if we are educating and if we're talking about science, I really don't think that we should have to censor ourselves to that degree because it confuses people. People are already confused. And now we're using this jargon and these weird code words. And people are like, are you talking about gardening? Are you talking about cannabis?
Yeah, you're trying to demystify cannabis whilst using a whole new language that people have to learn.
Yeah, and it's like it makes me really, really, really sad to have to like do that sort of self-censorship. And you'll notice in most of my content, I don't. And I definitely take the L for that. I mean, on Instagram, I've been deleted over 10 times. My channel is always, 12 community guideline violations can't be recommended to anyone. And that does limit, the value of your message and the growth of your channel, which, kind of it's a little sad for sure. But my mentality is just keep creating content. You'll find the right people. So I just like keep doing what I'm doing. I'm really trying to shift towards YouTube as well, because even though they demonetize you, at least I can speak the way I want to speak and they won't, delete my videos. So I've really been enjoying YouTube lately, and I put my podcast up there too, which has been great for people to be able to smoke with me while I'm, chilling and all that fun stuff. But it has been a journey for sure. And I don't know what's going to change it, like if we're ever going to see these restrictions lifted on social media, but it's hard in the cannabis space. I see a lot of creators either stop producing cannabis content because, I don't do that full time. I'm not a full-time content creator, but if I was, I can't imagine how difficult it would be to get money from like these different sponsors or whatever you call them that are paying you to create content, like if you can't talk about it or show it. So I think we're all in a pretty difficult position, but there is like a community around it where we try to share other people's videos. We try to share the message. It's just really hard to find if you don't know we exist out there because the algorithm ain't showing us to you.
No, and it is really disappointing, because this is such important educational content, and we need people to understand this. And people are crying out for this content too. When there are all these extra barriers, it does make it really disheartening sometimes. But I think this is where the cannabis community truly comes together, where we lift ourselves up in lieu of, the giant companies lifting us up, because they're certainly not very keen on what we're doing.
Yeah, 100%. And like the community really is like amazing on social media and in person. Like if anybody's out there listening to this and like if you can go to a weed event, go to a weed event. I mean, you're going to make so many friends. Like you'll find your people at these events. And another thing we do is called Weird Brains, which is an advocacy thing for neurodivergent people with ADHD, autism, who really react well to cannabis. And we're trying to emphasize, like, create space for us in the cannabis industry. We're the people who are most passionate about this, and we need this medicine to function. And we really don't uplift these voices very often. But, like the weird people, the weird brains, like, we run the industry because like we always have. When it was legal, when it was not legal, like we've always been passionate about this because it just itches our brain in like the perfect way.
I'm a big fan of the podcast. It's been an important resource for me to kind of learn and gain new knowledge. I really love what you're doing. A couple of my favorite episodes are actually where you're center stage, the anxiety episode, the endocannabinoid system episode, where you are, front and center teaching, basically. I love those. What are your favorite episodes? What would you recommend people listen to if they were wanting to get into the show?
Oh, I love this question. And thanks for saying that. I'm always like, do people like when I'm just yapping, or is this like annoying? So maybe I'll do some new ones of the single ones in this next season.
You know what you're talking about, Riley. That's why I like those episodes. Like, I think it's a rare skill to be able to maintain like a single monologue, for half an hour, 45 minutes. When it's interesting content and when you care as much as you do, that's why I love those episodes. So not my usual favorite medium, but when you do it, I love that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that means a lot. So yeah, my favorite episodes. Hmm. The one with Twinkle Periani from Abstracts Tech, that was one of my favorite ones, where she was talking about these different smelly molecules in cannabis that are not the terpenes. They're the flavorants or the other smells. I think she's really, really well spoken, and she's just like a very casual educator. So I think that one's really great. What other ones do I like? I like all of the actually, the reason I started a podcast is I love yapping about science and like I want to keep learning too. So especially like when there's new research coming out, for me having a reason to talk about these these research studies with these other researchers, I'm like, oh my God, what a cool opportunity. I don't know if you heard the recent story about these pesticides and the vapes in California. These illegal
No.
Oh my gosh. So there's a recent story that came out that there's been a lot of illegal pesticides found in vape cartridges in the California legal market, like being sold at dispensaries. And I had the pleasure of sitting down with one of the reporters, and this will actually probably be the first episode of the new season. And I sat down with the reporter and I'm like, tell me about this. Like, what did you do? Like, how did you even know this was a problem? And then, like, how did you look into it? And I think that's one of my favorite ones I've recorded so far because it's so tangible and practical to people. Cause like we always associate legal markets with healthier, safer products. And this is pretty groundbreaking that there's illegal pesticides from China in our legal California dispensary products. That's
That's a big
concerning.
worry. Yeah, and it's the legal industry saying, hey, come to our legal, safe industry. It's a way that we destigmatize as well by having this safer industry than the quote unquote black market. So I'm really excited to hear that episode because that is a big concern. I know from your episode about the smokability that there are safe levels of certain chemicals and compounds in vape cartridges. But to know that, yes, a quote unquote safe legal product might not be is very concerning for the image of the industry.
Yeah, what was the craziest is like California actually has extremely rigorous testing standards for pesticides. I think they test for like 64 or something crazy, like a huge number. But these ones were ones that were not tested for. So farms were using them in like pretty high amounts because they knew that they weren't going to fail a test because nobody was looking for them. They didn't even know that they were there. And the way that testing labs work is like, okay, I have these 20 things I need to test for, run and look for those 20 things and then quantify them and report them. They're not looking for things that they don't know aren't there, which is a really scary thing to think about.
I know that you're taking a little break from the pod right now because you're working on a book. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about the book. But yeah, I've had to like step back from all of the other stuff I had going on because I had a really hard deadline actually at the end of this month. And I was like, I need to just write for a little bit. But the book is essentially on a practical guide to cannabis from a science perspective and like really talking about the tools that I've been talking about in this podcast of understanding that there's ways to curate your experience to your needs, whether it's like wanting to get high, not wanting to get high, using different types of flower, consumption methods, but also looking at the research into things like cannabis and pregnancy, cannabis and driving, these really, really stigmatized topics that we really don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole, but at the same time, we're not doing anyone any good by not talking about it. So really just trying to talk about what research we do have, but also like community anecdotes too, and comparing the safety of cannabis in pregnancy to Zofran in pregnancy and understanding like there's risks to everything. And like my job as the writer of this book is to give you all the information and the tools for you to make an educated decision about your health journey. I'm never going to be like, all right, anyone reading this book, if you're not dry or vaping, you're dumb. That's not the point. It's just like I understand everyone's body's different and all of the education I've been working on over the past few years, it's like I'm really using that as a scaffold for writing this book and understanding like if I make a TikTok about a specific subject and I get all these cool community stories and some people saying, well, that's not true for these, but like I'm using all of the information that I've gathered from the community and from literature to really try to write this really comprehensive book about cannabis science from a scientist perspective, but also from a stoner perspective, which we haven't seen that combination before.
It's a great duality, and I'd love to know your perspective, whether it's as a scientist, as a consumer, or both. What is your utopic view of legalization? There are these patchwork approaches all across the world, particularly all across your country. There's 30 odd states with a version of legalization, all doing it different to the next. What do you see as kind of like the pillars of a good system?
Home grow is a must. Like I will die on that. Like we need home grow. We have the right to cultivate nature. We are nature, right? Okay. So that's part of it for sure. I really like what Germany did for public consumption as far as You can't consume everywhere all the time, but I think it's from like 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. You can consume in like all outdoor spaces, which is like, wow, that's so rational. Like that's when the children are in bed and the adults are out having fun. So let them have fun, you know? It's like that made sense a lot to me because I see both sides of public consumption. Like as a stoner, I'm like, I want to smoke everywhere all the time. But then also as like someone who has a lot of friends with kids and some older people I know aren't comfortable with that. And I don't believe we should be making people uncomfortable either, you know? So I think that's a really good kind of medium ground for public consumption, for sure. And then, I mean, if we have home grow, I think we'll have dispensaries, we'll have an adult use market, but we also need to protect our med patients a lot. And we have not been doing that, at least in the United States. We see states that bring on these recreational adult use markets, their medical programs plummet, die almost immediately, you know, and I think we really need to make sure we're protecting medical patients first, and then we can worry about everyone else after. So that would be my priority in like kind of organizing something. But we also need consistency, like what the US is doing with these like islands of prohibition among these seas of legal. Like what do you mean? So we can't drive through New England? Like you're going from a legal state to a illegal state to a legal, like that's dumb. What, like it's so dumb. So we just need some sort of like consistency so people feel one, safe, but two, like also informed. It almost seems like the current system is set up so people are not informed, and that makes people feel really nervous using cannabis because they don't know if they can consume in public. They don't know if they can drive with it. They don't know the rules and regs where they're going. And yeah, I think we need to have some sort of consistency, which is only going to happen with federal legalization, which we're a little further than closer to right now.
Yeah, every time, like, you know, we're the same in Australia. Every time we think we're, you know, just about to get there, it's like, oh no, it's going to be another 10 years. Like, oh, we're surely 2 to 5 years away. Nope, another 10 years. It just seems to, yeah, it's such a tease, isn't it?
Well, it's so funny that the FDA was like, "Hey guys, cannabis has medicinal value," and everyone's like, "Whoa! Like let's celebrate, let's go crazy." But like we just talked about having 30,000 publications, and like we have so much information that cannabis is like a great medicinal product. And the fact that it took the FDA this long to just come out and say like it has medicinal value and it might be rescheduled to Schedule 3, and like you know we're all celebrating, and it's like, yo, they just said might, like they didn't even do anything. They haven't done anything yet. It's still a Schedule 1 drug. Like as right now we're talking, it's a Schedule 1 drug in the US. I mean, we're gonna keep pushing. Any forward progress is great, but also like the more radical we are making a statement. Like regardless if you live in a state that it is illegal, there's still thousands and thousands, if not, you know, millions of people consuming every single day. And the more we can show, like, despite whatever you're putting a title on this, like we're doing it anyway, and we're still not harming ourselves or society. It is a pretty big statement that nobody has ever died from this plant alone. Like that's a really big statement to make when we think of how many cannabis consumers there are across the world.
Well, Riley, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. The final segment of the show is called Pauls of Wisdom, and though we appreciate the long-form conversation, we try to leave the listener with a key takeaway, dinner party fact, or call to action. So, Riley, what is your Paul of Wisdom?
I could drop fun facts about your endocannabinoid system, you know, all day, every day, but I think it's really important for consumers to know your body makes cannabinoids. Your body makes cannabinoids that are interacting with the cannabinoid receptors in your body. And when we take in this plant, those cannabinoids from the plant are interacting with our body in the similar way as our own body's molecules. So this is the reason why there's so much medicinal value, is the plant is essentially replicating compounds our own body makes. And it's a really, really, really special relationship that we have with this plant. And that's why it's so unique.
What is the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you or follow your work?
Yeah, so I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram, and I'm on YouTube under the name Cannabichem. So that's CANNABICHEM. You can check out our nonprofit at appliedpharmacognosy.org, which is a tough word to spell. That's pharma and then COGNOSY.org. You can check out our website, and then you could also just email me at riley.kirk@appliedpharmacognosy.org if you want to get in touch.
Dr. Riley Kirk, it's been an absolute delight to spend this time with you. You make cannabis science interesting, accessible, and fun. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me on. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks for listening to Give and Toke Cannabis Conversations presented by Plant Ed. Visit planteducation.net.au and use the code GIVETOKE10 at checkout to save.